On January 19, 2017, the United States Army announced the winner of the most competitive handgun procurement program in modern military history. The Modular Handgun System competition had taken years. It had consumed hundreds of thousands of test rounds. It had drawn entries from Beretta, FN America, Heckler & Koch, CZ, Smith & Wesson, and Glock. The Army evaluated every major pistol manufacturer on Earth, put their designs through endurance testing and environmental stress and round count trials, and arrived at a decision. The winner was SIG Sauer, whose P320 platform was designated the M17 in full size and the M18 in carry configuration. A $580 million contract, a new era. There was one problem with this picture. The Special Operations units that conduct the most dangerous work in the American military, Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Marine Raiders, the operators of Delta Force, were not carrying the M17. They were not waiting for the M17. They were carrying the Glock 19, an Austrian-designed compact pistol that had entered SOCOM inventory not by winning a competition, not through a formal head-to-head evaluation against the M9 it was supposed to replace, but through a gap in procurement rules that barely anyone outside the Special Operations community knew had been opened. That gap had been created more than a decade earlier. It had been opened by Special Forces operators who wrote a requirement so precisely worded that it could describe only one pistol, and then submitted that pistol to testing. The Army picked its gun in a competition. Special Forces picked theirs in a carefully worded document. And the pistol that won through a document is the one that spread to every elite unit in the American military, to the FBI, to 65% of law enforcement agencies in the United States. That is the story, not the story of a better gun winning a fair fight. The story of how institutions actually change, not through the official channels they design for that purpose, but through the side doors that operators find when the official channels aren't delivering what the mission requires. To understand why that side door existed, you need to understand what the Army was issuing, why the people carrying it wanted something different, and where the Glock 19 came from in the first place. Because the pistol at the center of this story was not designed by a firearms engineer. It was not designed by anyone with military weapons experience. It was designed by a man who made curtain rods. If you want to understand how the Glock 19 ended up on the hip of every Green Beret and Navy SEAL, while the Army was busy running a $500 million competition to pick something else, stay with this one and subscribe if you want more like it. Because the story of that concealed carry requirement is one of the more interesting pieces of institutional jiu-jitsu in modern military history, and we are just getting started. Gaston Glock was born in Vienna on July 19, 1929. His father was a railway worker. He completed his engineering education after the war, the Second World War, which he experienced as a conscript near the end, a teenager pressed into a Wehrmacht that was already collapsing, and went to work as a plastics technician. In 1962, he married. The following year, together with his wife Helga, he founded a small company in Deutsch Wagram, a town outside Vienna. The company had 3 employees. It made curtain rods, door hardware, metal parts for windows, consumer goods assembled from the materials Glock understood best: wood, metal, synthetic polymers. There was no firearms division. There was no weapons ambition. There was a man with a machine shop and an engineering mind, making things people needed for their houses. By 1970, the Austrian military needed something else: field knives, field shovels, training hand grenades, cartridge belts. Glock's materials knowledge made his company a reasonable supplier, and the relationship with the Austrian Bundesheer, the Austrian Armed Forces, began with hardware, not weapons. The Glock Feldmesser 78, a knife bayonet that would remain in Austrian army service for decades, came out of this period. The company was growing. It was still not a firearms company. That distinction mattered to Gaston Glock, and then one day it stopped mattering entirely. The story that has been told many times, and that checks out, is this. In the early 1980s, Glock overheard two Austrian colonels in a hallway or a corridor near a government office. Accounts vary slightly on the setting, complaining that there was no handgun available that met their requirements. The Austrian military was still issuing the Walther P-38, a World War II-era design that had entered German service in 1940 and had been soldiering on well past its intended service life. The colonels needed something modern, something reliable, something that met the operational demands of a contemporary military force. Glock offered to design one. The colonels, by multiple accounts, laughed at him. He had no experience with firearms engineering. He had never professionally designed a pistol. He was the curtain rod man. What he had, which the established pistol manufacturers did not have in the same way, was a background in polymer engineering at a moment when polymer engineering was about to become the most important material science in the handgun industry. He also had, in his own words, the advantage of knowing nothing. The fact that I knew nothing about guns was to my advantage, he said later. He gathered Europe's top experts from the military, police, and civilian shooting communities and asked them what an ideal combat pistol should do, what existing designs got wrong, what features mattered, and what trade-offs were worth making. He collected their answers. Then he designed a working prototype in 3 months. The prototype was designated the Glock 17, his 17th patent, not a reference to its magazine capacity, though the coincidence of the number would later confuse the record. The pistol went through a battery of endurance and stress tests that the Austrian military used to evaluate new equipment. It was submerged. It was dropped. It was fired through thousands of rounds under adverse conditions. It outperformed every established competitor. In 1982, the Austrian Bundesheer adopted it as the P-80, Pistole 80, with an initial order of 25,000 units. The curtain rod man had built his country's service pistol in 3 months, on his first try. The design's core innovation was the frame. Every significant pistol in military service at that moment was built around a steel or aluminum alloy frame, materials that worked, that were proven, and that were heavy. Glock's frame was polymer, a high-strength nylon composite that he understood at a manufacturing level because he had been working with synthetic polymers for 2 decades. The polymer frame was dramatically lighter than steel. It was corrosion-resistant in ways that metal frames were not. And it allowed Glock to rethink how a pistol was assembled. Fewer parts, each one doing more. A design philosophy that reduced the total component count to approximately 35 pieces compared to the significantly more complex assemblies of contemporary competitors. 3 safeties, all internal: the trigger safety, the firing pin safety, and the drop safety. No external manual safety to train around. No double action to single action trigger transition to master under stress. One trigger pull felt like another. Pull it and it fires, every time. In 1985, Glock established its American headquarters in Smyrna, Georgia. By 1986, the company had its first American law enforcement contract. That is where the American story of the Glock begins. Not in a military arms room, but in a police department that was looking for the same things the Austrian colonels had been looking for: reliability, simplicity, weight savings, and a design that reduced training time without reducing performance. Across the Atlantic, and across approximately the same stretch of years, the United States Army was running a process that had nothing to do with curtain rods and a great deal to do with institutional inertia. The Joint Service Small Arms Program began in 1979, tasked with finding a replacement for the M1911A1, the Colt 45 that had been America's service pistol since 1911 and that was, by the late 1970s, wearing out faster than it could be replaced. The program's first decision was the caliber, 9 by 19 millimeter Parabellum, the NATO standard round, chosen for logistics compatibility with Allied forces in the event of a war with the Soviet Union in Europe. That decision was made before a single pistol was evaluated. The cartridge came first. The gun would follow. The first round of testing happened in 1980. Beretta, Colt, Smith & Wesson, Heckler & Koch, Fabrique Nationale, Walter, and the Spanish Star all submitted designs. The Beretta 92S1 design came out on top. The Army challenged the result and ran new tests. In those tests, every entry was rejected. A second round of Army-run tests produced the same result, everything rejected again. By 1984, the program was on its third attempt, with updated entries from Smith & Wesson, Beretta, SIG Sauer, Heckler & Koch, Walter, Steyr, and Fabrique Nationale. This time, two pistols made it to the final selection, the Beretta 92SBF and the SIG Sauer P226. Both pistols passed the endurance benchmarks at comparable levels. Both demonstrated reliability under the standardized test conditions. The selection, in the end, turned on price. The Beretta came in at approximately $230 per unit. The SIG came in at approximately $500 per unit. On February 14, 1985, the Army officially adopted the Beretta 92F as the M9 pistol. The M9 was a full-sized, all-metal pistol with a double-action and single-action trigger system, meaning the first shot required a long, heavy trigger pull that cocked and released the hammer simultaneously, while subsequent shots used a shorter, lighter single-action pull on a hammer already cocked by the slides cycling. It weighed 33.3 ounces unloaded. Its barrel was 4.9 inches. Its overall length was 8.5 inches. For a conventional military role, a sidearm carried in a flap holster by support personnel who would rarely, if ever, fire it in anger, those specifications were adequate. For operators conducting high-tempo close-quarters work in unfamiliar terrain, operating in civilian clothes, carrying the pistol as a primary rather than a backup weapon, the specifications were a different story. The institutional resistance to acknowledging that distinction is what makes the next part of the story worth telling. Because by the early 2000s, a generation of men was entering Army Special Forces through the 18X program, direct enlistment into Special Forces rather than the traditional path through conventional infantry who had grown up shooting Glocks, in law enforcement academies, in civilian competition circuits, on their own time, with their own money. They knew what the Glock felt like compared to the M9. They knew the weight difference. They knew what happened to a double-action trigger pull under adrenal stress at 2 in the morning during a direct action raid. They arrived in the Special Forces community with opinions already formed, and those opinions pointed toward Deutsch Wagram, not Brescia. And then Delta Force made a move that changed everything. Around 2003 or 2004, the exact year is not publicly confirmed, the Combat Applications Group, the unit commonly known as Delta Force, acquired Glock 22 pistols, chambered in .40 Smith & Wesson. The .40 caliber was something of an institutional crossover, a round developed partly out of the FBI's experience after the 1986 Miami shootout, a caliber that sat between the 9mm and the .45 automatic in power. Delta's procurement latitude, operating under Joint Special Operations Command, gave the unit access to equipment that conventional Army units could not acquire without going through channels that would have said no. They used that latitude. They got their Glocks. The rest of Special Forces noticed immediately, and the pressure that had been building from below found a new direction to push. The Glock 19 entered production in 1988 as a compact variant of the Glock 17. Where the 17 is a full-size duty pistol, the kind of pistol you wear on a belt in a duty holster when everyone can see it, the 19 is something else. 7.36 inches in overall length, 5.04 inches in height, 1.26 inches in width, 23.63 ounces unloaded, against the M9's 8.5 inches, 5.4 inches, 1.5 inches, and 33.3 ounces. The differences accumulate into something operationally significant. The Glock 19 is nearly 10 ounces lighter than the M9. That is more than half a pound. On a person who is already carrying a rifle, ammunition, body armor, communication equipment, medical gear, and specialty tools for whatever the mission requires, half a pound is not a trivial number. It is a number that compounds over every patrol, every infill, every hour of a deployment. The frame's polymer construction accounts for most of that weight advantage. The design philosophy accounts for the rest. Where the M9's double-action and single-action trigger system required a shooter to train for two distinct trigger pulls and manage the transition between them, the long, heavy first pull, the short, light subsequent pulls, the muscle memory required to be accurate with both under stress, the Glock 19's safe action system presented a consistent trigger pull on every shot. Not light, not heavy, consistent. The three internal safeties, trigger safety, firing pin safety, drop safety, engaged and disengaged automatically as part of the firing sequence. There was nothing to disengage before shooting, nothing to re-engage after. For a community that valued training economy, getting operators to a high standard of performance in less time, with less repetition, against missions that required them to be proficient with a dozen different skills simultaneously, the trigger architecture of the Glock was not a minor advantage. It was a compounding one. Full-sized Glocks, the 17, the 34, were comparable in overall dimensions to the M9. Acquiring them would not have satisfied any operational gap that the M9 couldn't theoretically fill. The procurement system would have seen right through a request for a full-sized Glock as a simple preference substitution, which Big Army had already declined to authorize. The Glock 19 was a different category of object. It was concealable in a way the M9 was not, and the full-sized Glocks were not. And concealment, it turned out, was exactly the operational gap that existed, and that no one in the procurement system had written a requirement to fill. In the mid-2000s, Special Forces operators identified a documented need. There was no compact handgun in the SOCOM inventory for use during operations in civilian clothes, conducting surveillance, advising partner forces in environments where a uniform and a full-sized pistol would identify the wearer as a foreign military presence, moving through environments where concealment was not optional but operationally essential. The M9 could not do this. The requirement that was written to address this gap was, and this is the part that rewards close reading, worded with a specificity that left very little interpretive space. A compact handgun for civilian clothes operations. The specification, multiple accounts from people inside the Special Forces community confirm, was written to describe the Glock 19. Not generically, specifically. The pistol was submitted to Special Operations testing and evaluation. It passed. It was adopted as a supplement, not a replacement, because a full replacement of the M9 across Special Forces would have required a procurement action that Big Army would have reviewed and could have blocked. The concealed carry requirement created a narrow lane. Special Forces drove through it. The first Glock 19s appeared in Special Forces arms rooms in late 2006. A veteran Special Forces marksmanship instructor who was present at Fort Bragg at the time and has written about this period in detail described it this way. The pistols were issued as a supplement, envisioned for only certain teams or certain operators based on mission. There were not enough for every man. Operational detachment, alphas, the 12-man teams that are the basic unit of Special Forces, rotated their Glocks to deploying teams and kept their M9s for stateside use. The men who needed the Glock 19 for the mission they were about to run got the Glock 19. The men stateside held a pistol they didn't prefer and waited for their turn. From 2006 through approximately 2015, an estimated 60 to 70% of Special Forces soldiers had an issued Glock 19. The remaining 30 to 40% were still carrying M9s. That is not full adoption. That is a program in transition, the kind of transition that happens when a requirement has been satisfied on paper, but the supply hasn't yet caught up with the demand. The gap between what had been authorized and what had actually been fielded closed in late 2015 when Special Forces Command announced a purchase of Generation 4 Glock 19s with modular optic system cuts, one for every soldier in United States Army Special Forces. The side door, opened in the mid-2000s by a carefully worded procurement document, had become wide enough to issue through. In 2016, Special Operations Command adopted the Glock 19 outright, not as a specialty item, not as a supplement for civilian clothes operations, but as the standard compact pistol for SOCOM components across all branches: Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Marine Raiders, Air Force Special Operations. The requirement that had been written to describe one gun had, over the course of a decade, become the requirement that described what the entire Special Operations community carried. 2 years after the SOCOM standardization, the Trijicon RMR Type 2 red dot sight was adopted across the platform, a standardization of the optic ecosystem that assumed the Glock 19 as its base, not the M9, not the incoming M17. The Army's official answer arrived on January 19, 2017. SIG Sauer P320, M17 and M18, a $580 million contract. Glock had entered the Modular Handgun System competition, the same competition, with a Glock 19 modified to include a manual thumb safety, a feature the design had never carried, added because the MHS requirements demanded it. Glock lost. The Army had its answer. SOCOM already had a different one and was not reconsidering. The same year the Army announced the M17, the Federal Bureau of Investigation finalized an $85 million contract for the Glock 19M, a variant built to the FBI's custom specifications, replacing the Glock 23 and 40 Smith & Wesson that agents had carried since the late 1990s. The FBI's decision to return to 9mm after decades of 40 caliber was itself a story. Advances in defensive ammunition had closed the performance gap between 9mm and heavier calibers while reducing recoil, allowing faster and more accurate follow-up shots, and increasing magazine capacity. The 9mm case had been made, definitively, by the FBI's own ballistics testing. The Glock 19M was the implementation of that case. By 2017, 65% of American law enforcement agencies were issuing Glock pistols, the company's own figure, contested upward to as high as 74% in some analyses. By 2020, an estimated 20 million Glock pistols had been produced globally. The platform that the Austrian army had ordered in quantities of 25,000 in 1982 had become, in the 40 years since, one of the most widely distributed mechanical objects on Earth. The reach of the Glock 19 specifically traces through a chain of adoption decisions that each reinforced the next. Delta Force takes the Glock 22 around 2003. That creates pressure within Special Forces for a Glock of their own. Special Forces writes the concealed carry requirement and gets the Glock 19 in 2006. From 2006 to 2015, the pistol proves itself in operational use across every theater of the global war on terror, not in testing conditions, not on a controlled range, but in the environments where the design's advantages and weaknesses are both fully visible. By 2015, Special Forces Command has enough operational data to justify a full-force purchase. By 2016, SOCOM has standardized across its components. By 2017, the FBI is on board. By 2018, the optic standard is set. Each step in that chain was enabled by the step before it. The concealed carry requirement did not get the Glock 19 adopted across SOCOM. What it did was get the Glock 19 into operational use in a context where it could prove its case on its own terms. The institutional momentum that followed was a consequence of performance, not of procurement strategy. The procurement strategy just got the gun in the door. The irony that closes this layer is precise. In the same institutional moment, 2016 and 2017, the Army ran a $580 million competition to select America's service pistol, and the FBI and SOCOM independently concluded that the pistol they wanted was the one that had lost that competition. The same gun, different doors. There is a detail in the Glock story that surfaces in almost no mainstream account of the pistol's history, and it is worth sitting with, not because it changes the engineering, but because it reframes what the success of the design actually cost the man who built it. In 1999, Gaston Glock was 70 years old. The company he had built from a curtain rod factory in Deutsch Wagram was the dominant pistol manufacturer in American law enforcement. The Glock 17 and Glock 19 were in holsters from Vienna to Los Angeles. The company was producing tens of thousands of pistols per week. The financial success was extraordinary, and it had attracted people who wanted a share of it through means other than manufacturing. Charles Ewart was Glock's tax advisor and trusted associate. He had, over a period of years, embezzled millions of dollars from the company. When Ewart concluded that the embezzlement was close to discovery, he made a decision. He hired a hitman named Jacques Pecheur, a former professional wrestler, to kill Gaston Glock in a parking garage in Luxembourg. The method of choice was a rubber mallet. Pecheur attacked Glock outside the garage. Glock fought back. He was 70 years old, and he fought back hard enough that the attack failed. Pecheur was subdued. Both Ewart and Pecheur were subsequently convicted. Gaston Glock survived and continued to run the company he had built and died in December 2023 at 94 years old, still chairman of Glock GmbH. It is a story that belongs in a crime novel, and it is completely true, and it is almost never mentioned in the same breath as the engineering history of the pistol that bears his name. The other thing that surfaces rarely, when Glock entered the Modular Handgun System competition in 2017, the pistol they submitted was not a standard Glock 19. The MHS requirements included a mandatory manual safety, an external, user-operated safety that the Glock design had never carried in any of its generations. The Glock's entire operating philosophy was built around the premise that internal automatic safeties were superior to manual ones, that the manual safety introduced training complexity and the risk of a shooter failing to disengage it under stress. Adding a thumb safety to a Glock was, in a meaningful sense, a philosophical contradiction. Glock did it anyway to compete. The pistol lost, and the operators who were already carrying the Glock 19 in its standard, no manual safety configuration continued to carry it. What the MHS outcome reveals, read in full context, is not that the Glock 19 failed a test. It is that by 2017, the result of the Army's competition was largely irrelevant to the people for whom the pistol question mattered most. SOCOM had already decided. The FBI had already decided. The law enforcement market had already decided. The Army's $580 million competition produced a pistol for the Army. The Glock 19 was already everywhere else. The reframe that the overlooked angle produces is this. The Army picked its pistol in a process designed to be definitive. Special Forces picked theirs in a process designed to be narrow. The narrow process turned out to be the one that changed the landscape, because the people running it knew exactly what they needed and wrote a document that said so, and then a decade of operational use confirmed the answer before anyone with the authority to reverse it had a reason to try. Return to January 19, 2017, for a moment. The announcement goes out. SIG Sauer has won the Modular Handgun System competition. The M17 and M18 will replace the Beretta M9 as the standard service pistol of the United States military. It is a genuine institutional moment, the end of 30 years of the M9, the beginning of a new platform, the conclusion of a process that consumed years and hundreds of millions of dollars of planning and testing and evaluation. The Army has spoken. In the SOCOM arms rooms, nothing changes. The Glock 19s are already there. They have been there in some units for more than a decade. The operators who carried them through deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the dozens of other theaters where special operations forces were working in that period, did not need an institutional announcement to tell them what the pistol had already demonstrated. The announcement was about something else, about the conventional force, about logistics chains, about the 800,000 soldiers for whom the pistol is a sidearm rather than a primary weapon. For that population, the M17 and M18 are the right answer to the right question. The Glock 19 is the answer to a different question. Not what does a service pistol need to do for the average soldier? What does a compact, concealable, lightweight, striker-fired pistol need to do for a 12-man team that is about to conduct a direct-action raid in civilian clothes in a city where being identified as a foreign military presence is itself a mission failure? That question was written down in a procurement document in the mid-2000s. It was written with enough precision that only one pistol on Earth could satisfy it. The people who wrote it knew that. That was the point. Gaston Glock, in the early 1980s, overheard two colonels complaining about a pistol that did not yet exist. He offered to build it. They laughed at him. He went back to his machine shop, the same facility that had been making curtain rods and knife handles and grenade components, and designed a working prototype in 3 months. The Colonel's institution ordered 25,000 of them. 40 years later, the design that came out of that offer is carried by every Navy SEAL, every Green Beret, every Marine Raider, and an estimated 65% of the law enforcement officers in the United States. The Army, in the same period, ran multiple formal competitions to select its service pistol. It arrived eventually, at a different answer. The institutional lesson, if there is one, and institutions are notoriously slow to learn from their own history, is not that competitions are the wrong way to select weapons. It is that competitions answer the questions they are designed to answer, and the questions they are designed to answer are sometimes not the questions that matter most to the people who will carry the result. Special Forces found a gap between the question the procurement system was asking and the question the mission was asking, and they wrote a document that fit through that gap. The document described a concealed handgun for civilian clothes operations. What it actually described was the pistol they had already decided they needed, in a format the procurement system could process and approve. That is how the Glock 19 became the gun that SOCOM carries while the Army carries something else. Not because it won a competition, because someone wrote it into a requirement with enough precision that the competition was over before it started, and then 10 years of operational use made the case that no competition result was ever going to unmake. In the parking garage in Luxembourg in 1999, a man tried to kill Gaston Glock with a rubber mallet and failed. Glock went back to Deutsche Wagram. The company kept building. The pistol kept spreading. The colonels who laughed at him in that hallway in the early 1980s, the ones who said a curtain rod manufacturer had no business designing a combat pistol, were carrying his design within the year